Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC, and it's in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom, and it's in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz, the Eidach Yom V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We are middle of chapter 24, Perek Chav Daled, in Tanya, which, as the Alter Rebbe begins the chapter, it says, Zelu umazeh, after talking about how Anochi Hashem Elokecha is the root and the essence of all positive mitzvahs, the expression of divine unity in our existence. Every mitzvah we do, we are essentially uniting and channeling and becoming a vehicle for the divine, as explained in chapter 23. So Lu'umazeh, all the leisas are rooted and personified in Lo Yilcha Lekim Acherim. The antithesis to Achdus is duality, is that there is a feeling, a sense, God forbid, of a reality that's outside of God. And we discussed, in understanding this, we discussed that there's two aspects to this. There's the setup that God created, an environment, a situation where it's possible for someone to deny God. That's through God's concealments. If there was no tzimtzum, if there was no concealment, then it would not be possible. Like Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, in the language of Chassidus and from Kabbalah, it's a likus b'pshitis. It's a seamless, divine consciousness is a seamless, all-pervasive reality. There's no room for anything opposite of what God is. It's only due to concealment, to a concealment. The concealment itself is also, its purpose is revelation. Its purpose to overcome the concealment. But because of the concealment, there's a possibility now. Because you can deceive yourself into thinking that God is not watching, that you're on your own. So that creates an environment. And then there's acting on it. And that's a key difference. The fact that there's such an environment, that means that you've been given independence. It's no different. Well, it's different, but as an example, it's no different than a teacher or a parent who wants the child and student to grow up stand on their own feet. So you have to allow them a certain measure of autonomy and independence. The goal of the autonomy and independence is for them to do it on their own and stand on their own feet. So the very fact that you've given them autonomy means you've somewhat withdrawn yourself from influencing the results, but now it's up to them. Now, if the person acts properly, he will not be deceived by this so-called autonomy and do whatever he likes. He'll do what should be done. But if he doesn't do what should be done, then we're dealing with a situation that's far worse, because now you're dealing with someone actually defying God. So the fact that God created a world of Kelipos and Sitra Achra, yes, it's not pleasant, but it's the way, like we spoke about Kelipos Shemer Lepri. The Eibishter created a world where the fruit has a shell around it, and it's called a klipa. Klipas v'sitra achra is called a klipa, but it's really a shell to protect the fruit. It only becomes a problem when you start worshiping the shell as becoming an entity of its own. So the shell on its own is aware that it's a shell for the fruit, and it has its own identity, even its own ego. The real problem begins when someone who takes it, instead of eating the fruit, eats the shell, or worships the shell. So that's the basis of what the Alter Rebbe said in Tanya. He said that, number one, that when a person is engaged in doing something, in being, God forbid, a transgression, either daraisa or darabanan, which is from the shasal leisaseh, from daraisa, or kol yisuri darabanan, all the transgressions, prohibitions of the rabbis. So, being that it's against God's will, so what's happening is, so just as they are called Aveda Zara and Alikim Achedim, the Kelipos, so too, because of the concealment, they're concealing the divine behind it. That's why it's called Alikim Achedim, as we learned in earlier chapters. chapter 22. So too, the person and his and the garments and the nefesh that is manifesting itself in doing these transgressions, God forbid, also is called Avodah Zarah. But then the Alter Rebbe says furthermore, it's much worse than that. It's worse than Avodah Zarah. It's worse than the Kelipos, because he says the b'teilim v'tfeilim elav v'gruim abchusim imenu ma'od. Because the Kelipos in Sitra Achra are not melubish beguf chumri. They're a spiritual state. It's a spiritual concealment. So correct, there is an element of separation where they feel independent, but it's not melubish beguf chumri. And therefore the Kelipos Sitra Achra is aware, like every creature in this world is aware, that there is Yedeus Rabbeinu ve'einu meredes by. It knows its master, and it does not defy it. It knows that it is here because God created it. There's a certain consciousness of that. Whereas a person who acts on it is far worse than that, because he's actually giving it body. And therefore, as he says afterwards, the exact words, let's use his exact words. I'm just skipping before we go. I'll go back in a moment to read it more in detail. Imkena Adama Evil Retzenis Baruch Hu Garua Pochas Harba Ma'ed Masitrach V'Klipa Nikras Avedazar V'Lekim Acherim. Because he's choosing actively. Not the Klipa hasn't chosen to be a Klipa. It was created as such. So yes, indeed, it is in a state of not Kedusha. Kedusha is completely bottle, like we learned earlier in chapter 6 in Tanya, that Kedusha means something is completely sublimated and subjugated to the divine. That it's not. But you can't say that it is deliberately going ahead and defying God and pushing God out of the picture. Whereas a person who makes that choice, then it's worse, like he says, Garua, Upachas Harba from the Sitra Achra itself. So now, let's go back to the Klippa Sitra Achra. Because L'cheira asked the Alter Rebbe, what do you mean? You just said that you call the Klippa Sitra Achra Avodah Zarah, Elikim Acherim. So what are you saying to me that it's not Klippa Sitra, it's not Avodah Zarah? So it's true, like Bilam said, Lo yuchal laver as pi Hashem. I cannot defy God's words. But the Avodah Zarah, af shenikra Avodah Zarah, so the Alter Rebbe introduces from the Gemara Menachos, hakorolei alakad alakaya. That even when you're talking about someone that worships himself and sees himself as an entity, but that does not mean he denies God. He calls God the God of all gods. That's the expression of the Gemara. The Gemara is, let me just give the Makom for this. The Gemara is in Menachos 110a, Kuf Yud Aleph. So the expression is Hakoralek Elakad Lekaya. That even the idol worshippers, they recognize the fact, they call him the God of gods. So yes, indeed, they call their idol a god, or they call themselves, in this case we're talking even the Klippa itself, but there's a God of gods. And therefore, ve'eni michem laver klal adosenu yisbarach. That's why they're unable to transgress against God's will. I'm going to say it later, I believe, in this chapter. So when you look at animals, for example, they have no free will. And they're out in the wild, predators, hunting. They don't have a choice. That's their nature. Now, does that mean that they are completely Kedusha and holy? Not necessarily. But they are wired that way. So they recognize as a God of gods, and they cannot therefore transgress God's will. Because they're cognizant, and they know and understand that God is their life energy and their sustenance. But then still remains the question, so if that's the case, so why don't you just call them neutral? Why do you call them Avodah Zarah, Elikim Acherim? Why do you call them Avodah Zarah? So the Alter Rebbe goes back to what he explained in chapter 22. How did it happen? How is it possible there should be even a situation of Klippa? We're not talking about acting on it. Even the environment, we said it's a hester panim. It's a concealment. He explained there what means Elikim Acherim. So if you remember the word Acherim, he explained in several ways. One of them coming from the other side, from the back side. Elikim Acherim, not just other. Elikim Acherim, it's like when you give a gift to someone that you dislike, for whatever reason, you don't give it to him face to face in a beautiful, warm way. You throw it over your shoulder. It's a mashal example. The same idea. So anything that comes from an energy that's flowing, that's sucking the energy from the external part of the divine's will, that's why Klippa are this way. So they're coming from a concealed state. That concealed state creates a situation of what he called Avodah Zarah. There's another sense of another entity that's not purely Ein Milvade, not purely all-pervasive divine consciousness. Like it's not Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's the Ein Sof, it's the Ein after the Tzimtzum. But there's a Tzimtzum. So on one hand, there's a concealment, and therefore there's an element of Avodah Zarah. On the other hand, they cannot defy what God wants. Just like the Tzimtzum itself. The Tzimtzum has no choice. God created the Tzimtzum and everything that comes along with it. And then he continues in Alter Rebbe at what's he adding with this? Because if they are aware of the divine, they call it Elikad Elikaya, the God of gods. So why do they feel separate? So number one is because it's only getting from the Acharaim. But he adds also that it's in a form of makif. That the chayes that comes to them is in a form of makif. We'll soon talk about the chayes that does enter them. What does makif mean? It's detached. What we'd call dissonance. The example, one of the classic examples, it's not necessarily an example exactly for this, but the idea, where the Gemara says in Brachas, that a ganav, before he goes out to steal, he davens to Hashem to succeed. But we know the Eibishter said, Lo signiv. It's insanity. Makes no sense. It's one thing you want to ignore God, but it's like saying to the policeman who told you, do not steal, come help me steal. I'm praying to you to help me. Where's this dissonance? So Chassidus explains, because Amunah can be makif. It's not necessarily a person has fake Amunah. He actually has faith. But faith is not integrated. Like many times we have a value, we have an ideal that we believe in, but it hasn't become internalized. That's makif. And as a result of the makif, so in Kedusha, the Elikus enters Bepnimius. So the very thing itself is fully saturated with godliness. And bittul, therefore. When it comes to Klippas Yitrach, they don't have bittul. But that doesn't mean they deny God, that God exists. They also know that they cannot defy what God wants, but they don't have bittul. So it's like this in-between state. When the human being comes into the picture and acts on it and transgresses that, it's going to be far worse, as we mentioned, and we'll soon get back to. So it means it's not internalized. But nevertheless, there is energy inside them as well. Because first of all, there's nothing that can exist without some internal energy. So here we go back, that the chayis that does enter them, in a more pneumistic way, the klippas that is. So he said already that it's from acharayim to acharayim. Okay, but that's makif aleim. And then he continues and says, now, even the part that does enter, elasheni yikosam v'chayusam shebetecham, hu b'chinas golas betecham. So he adds one more thing. And even the energy that does enter and flow within them, and you you think because of that, maybe that would make the Kelipos more cognizant, more aware of godliness, and not be in a state of Avodah Zarah, meaning that I have my own identity outside of God. Says no, but it's in a form of galus. Which means that even the energy that's within them is in a displaced state. So the dissonance I mentioned can be defined in two ways. Dissonance, one, is that there's something removed. Like I said, a dissonance of faith. There's something you're aware of, but it's not internalized. Even the part that's internalized, you don't feel it's you. Your identity is defined by your ego, by yourself, in the Kelipos and Sitra Achra. So therefore, it's in a state of exile. And that is essentially the denial of God's oneness. As soon as there's something else, it's a denial of God's oneness. Like I said, the oneness that's all prevailing and all pervasive before the Tzimtzum is one thing. But here there's a concealment. But nevertheless, Aval Makol Mokim, says the Alter Rebbe, Einen Kefrim V'chichashu B'Hashem Legamri. Nevertheless, they do not deny or repudiate God's presence completely. V'loimar, to the point that they say that he is not Loihu, from Yirmiyahu Hey Yud Beis. That means he doesn't exist. They're not saying that. This is not a denial of God's existence. It's just a denial of God's all-pervasive unity. God exists, but I also exist. Elokad Elokaya. This is God and the God of gods. But I'm also a God. El Dekorole Elokad Elokaya. And he goes back to that expression. They call him God, the God of gods. Tahainu, which means chayusam v'kiyumim hanimshach v'yered aleim b'ritzeni yisbarach, because they recognize that their life energy and their vitality and sustenance is derived from His will, which flows down to them, like we said, in ofen makif or in an ofen of galus within them. Ulechein einan evrim ritzeni yisbarach le'elam. And that is why they never violate His will. So it's a very interesting situation here. And you would think otherwise. You'd think Kelipos and Sitra Achra, Avodah Zarah, like he said, are of the worst sort. But you see here that there's two parts. There's the part of the, like I said, the environment of concealment, and there's acting on it. They're not acting on it. They are just a creation, a product of God wanting to have a universe, a reality, a consciousness, an independent consciousness that allows for free will. So there's this paradox. The Rebbe does add in his notes here in Tanya that this is al arev tedaber. The Tanya is talking al arev. There are Kelipos and Sitra Achra, namely Sancheriv, for example, that completely denied God's existence. Not just Elokad Elokaya. There's a God and I'm also God. So there is, but that is an exception. It's not the rule, as the Rebbe writes in his notes here. And they cry out, Haniva Afsied, me and nothing else. So it's not just me and God, but me and nothing else. Yeah. So back to what we're talking about. So this is still the Kelipos and Sitra Achra themselves. The Imkain. So now that Alter Rebbe concludes, after this elaboration, he says, V'imkain, and if that's the case, that the Kelipos will never disobey God, even though they see themselves as an entity of their own, as an independent consciousness, that a person who violates God's will, is worse and much lower than the other side, than the sitra achra and the klipa and the shell. Because the shell, yes, has its own independent identity. And when all is good, the shell is actually protecting the fruit. But they will not violate. They will not violate God's will. So even though they're called Hanikra Anas Aveda Zara Velikim Acherim, they're called Taka Aveda Zara Velikim Acherim, idolatry and other gods. But nevertheless, they will not defy God's will. Whereas a person who's defied God's will is actively and deliberately, actively pushing away God from life. Not saying we can coexist, or I'm here and you're distant away from me, but you're pushing it away altogether. And that causes the transgressor to be utterly disconnected from God's seamless unity. More than the klipa itself. As if he denies God's oneness more than the klipa itself, chas v'shalom, God forbid. So you could ask the question, why does he say ki'ilu, keifer b'achdusei? Because in truth, as we're going to learn, even when a person transgresses, they also still have faith. It's just concealed. To quote exactly the lashon that I wanted to bring out here is this. Because even when you do the Aveda, the person, the truth is he always remains Amunah. However, in action, it's worse than the Klippa. Because B'Poel Mamish, in actuality, he is defying God. So that's the Bavarnish, because at the end of the day, Eid nishta vil, nishta ken sein abgerissen von Elikus. A Jew cannot and does not want to ever be separated from God. But in action, you could behave that way, and that makes it worse than the Klippa and Sitra Achra. Okay. Now, as he said at the outset, this is all due to the fact, because by acting, by transgressing, you're actually giving body, what he said, a guf. Mulubesh is beguf chumri. The klippa is a ruchniyazdika concealment. When you act and defy what you transgress and go against God's will, it's melubesh beguf chumri. And that's what causes this tremendous descent, or this tremendous violation, if you wish. So the fact that we live in a world where potentially a person can do terrible things, God forbid, that's one thing. But when you act on it, it changes everything. Like the question that's asked about Chet Eitz Hadas. Before they ate Eitz Hadas, they potentially could have eaten from it. But potential is not actual. In their mind, they may have said, hey, you know what? We know about good and evil, but let's taste it. In the Eitz Hadas, let's taste it. Once you taste, you've acted. A young child, or for that matter, a tzaddik, could know about right and wrong. But it's theoretical. As soon as you act on it, you've tasted from it. You've crossed the line and lost your innocence. That's when it's a whole new reality. You can't just turn the clock back. Like we see. Many people, hypothetically, they think, since hypothetically I can think about something, why not act on it? It's one of the ways people justify their own, sometimes wrongful behavior. But acting changes things. So now he continues to say, he now brings the source in Eitz Chaim, which will explain how is it possible that human beings in this world are capable of something much lower and worse than the Kelipos themselves. It's like he says in Eitz Chaim, Shar Mem Beis Seif Perek Daled, Shara, section 42, end of chapter 4. Shara sheba elam hazeh hachumri hu, that the evil in the physical world is shemrei haklipos, shemrei haklipos hagases chulu. It is the dregs of the coarse klipos left over out of the very end of the refinement process. So it's just like when you take, for example, any processing of a product, whether it's grain, whether it's grapes to wine, or anything. So the first thing you want to do is separate between the chaff and the wheat, between the dregs and the fruit. It's like throwing out the pits and retaining the fruit. So the Eitz Chaim uses that as an example. How did such darkness prevail in this world? When you start off in the higher worlds, everything in Atzilus is Kedusha, holiness, and Lo Yegur Chara, it's only goodness. How do we have a world where there's such darkness? As he says afterwards, where that the fears of this world are tough and evil, and wicked people prevail. How's that possible? So he says that's the process. As the refinement process continues, the last steps, you end up with the worst dregs in Elam Hazeh. So the Kelipos themselves, like we said, are shells. That's a spiritual force rooted in the higher worlds. They exist in a purer place. And yes, they are a shell, but they can't disobey God. But in the physical world, where what's left over are the last dregs, like the real waste. So there you have much deeper, darker concealment of the divine. That's why Kol Ma'aseh Elam Hazeh, Koshem V'Royim, V'Hashem Gevrim Be'V'Chulu. That's why the fears of this world are so tough and evil, and wicked people prevail. That's what allows. Again, it's an environment. It still doesn't mean we have to act on it. But then when you act on it, that's why it's worse than just the Kelipos themselves. Because the Kelipos can be in more refined states. Now, of course, the kavanah of all of this is to not act and transgress, and to transform our lives in this material world and make a dira b'tachtenim, as we shall learn later. But we'll stop here in chapter 24, TanyaApplied.com. You can find this in all previous programs. Everyone have a good tavach, Simon B'Tev, that all the dark is only meant for us to illuminate and bring out deeper light and goodness. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.